Blood on Italian marble is notoriously hard to clean. Most maids would scream, panic, or run when the bullets started flying. But when the reigning boss of the East Coast Syndicate was pinned down in his own mansion, his quietest housekeeper didn't flinch. She simply dropped her feather duster, picked up an abandoned HK-416 assault rifle, and changed the underworld forever. Damien Russo did not pay attention to the help. To the 34-year-old head of the Russo crime syndicate, the staff moving through his sprawling 70-acre estate in upstate New York were ghosts. They were paid exorbitant salaries to remain unseen, unheard, and absolutely tight-lipped about the duffel bags of untraceable $100 bills, the late-night meetings with corrupt state senators, and the occasional bloodstain on the imported Persian rugs. Among these ghosts was Valerie Hayes. Valerie had been working at the Oakhaven estate for 6 months. On paper, she was a 28-year-old woman with a sparse resume, a quiet demeanor, and a penchant for keeping her head bowed. She wore the standard black and white uniform, her dark hair pulled back into a severe utilitarian bun, her eyes always fixed on the floorboards. She cleaned Damien's private study, a room strictly off-limits to almost everyone else. Damien only knew 2 things about Valerie. She made a perfectly bitter espresso, and she never asked questions. He didn't know that every time she dusted his mahogany desk, her eyes quickly scanned the tactical blueprints of the Red Hook shipping ports he had left exposed. He didn't know that she had silently evaluated the fatal flaw in the patrol routes of his armed guards outside the perimeter. And he certainly didn't know that beneath the crisp white apron, Valerie carried scars from a classified JSOC operation in Bogota, a mission that had gone entirely sideways, forcing her to burn her identity and disappear into the shadows of the criminal underworld just to survive. For Valerie, cleaning a Mafia boss's mansion was the perfect cover. Men like Damien Russo never looked past a woman's uniform unless they wanted to sleep with her, and Valerie made sure she was entirely uninteresting. Tension had been bleeding into the estate for weeks. The Carmichael family, an Irish syndicate operating out of South Boston, had been aggressively expanding their territory. Silas Carmichael, a ruthless operator with a reputation for leaving no survivors, had explicitly threatened Damien's control over the eastern seaboard supply lines. On a rainy Tuesday evening, the atmosphere in Damien's study was suffocating. The air was thick with cigar smoke and the scent of expensive bourbon. Damien sat behind his desk, his jaw clenched, staring at his 2 top lieutenants, Thomas and Vincent. Silas isn't making a move yet, Thomas argued, pacing the length of the room. He doesn't have the manpower to breach Oakhaven. We have 20 heavily armed men on the perimeter. It's a fortress. Valerie was in the corner of the room, quietly polishing the glass of a vintage bookcase. Her movements were slow, rhythmic, and entirely ignored by the men. Silas doesn't do frontal assaults, Damien replied, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that commanded absolute authority. He rubbed his temples, feeling the onset of a migraine. He uses proxies. He bribes. He finds the weak link. I want the security detail doubled on the western gate. The cameras there have been glitching since the storm. Valerie paused her polishing for a fraction of a second. The western gate, she thought. The cameras aren't glitching from the storm. They're being systematically jammed. A standard localized EMP disruption loop. Someone on the inside is helping them. She wanted to speak up. The tactical error was so glaring it made her skin crawl, but she bit her tongue. She was a maid. Maids who offered military intelligence to Mafia bosses ended up in the Hudson River. She resumed her polishing, keeping her breathing even. Damien's dark eyes flicked over to her, catching the slight hesitation in her movement. He watched her for a moment. There was something odd about her. Most of the staff trembled when he was in the room, terrified of making a sound. Valerie moved with a strange, deliberate economy of motion, no wasted steps. Her posture, when she thought no one was looking, was perfectly straight, military straight. "Valerie," Damien said suddenly. The room went dead silent. Thomas and Vincent stopped arguing and looked at the maid. Valerie turned around slowly, keeping her eyes respectfully lowered to his chest level. "Yes, Mr. Russo? Bring us another bottle of the Macallan, and tell the kitchen to send up ice." "Right away, sir." As she walked out of the room, Damien watched her go. "Run a background check on her again," he murmured to Vincent once the heavy oak doors clicked shut. Vincent frowned. "The maid? Boss? She's been here half a year. We vetted her. She's nobody." "I don't care," Damien said, a cold instinct flaring in his gut. "Do it again. Dig deeper." But Damien's paranoia had latched onto the wrong target. Valerie wasn't the threat. The threat was already inside the gates, and time had just run out. The breach happened 3 nights later. It was 2 a.m. A violent thunderstorm was raging outside, masking the sound of suppressed gunfire at the perimeter. Silas Carmichael had not sent a ragtag group of street thugs. He had hired a specialized mercenary outfit, the Aegis Defense Group, heavily armed and equipped with night vision gear. The internal security betrayal that Valerie had suspected became a bloody reality. The corrupted guards at the western gate had let the strike team right through the perimeter. Valerie was in the basement laundry room, loading damp linens into the industrial dryers. She heard the faint, distinct pop, pop, pop of suppressed 5.56 caliber rifles over the rumble of thunder. Most people would have dismissed it as the storm, but Valerie's muscle memory triggered instantly. Double taps. Professional execution. She dropped the linens. The lights flickered and then died completely, plunging the massive estate into pitch darkness. The backup generators failed to kick in sabotaged. Upstairs, all hell broke loose. Damien awoke to the sound of his bedroom door splintering off its hinges. He rolled out of bed, grabbing the gold-plated Kimber 1911 from his nightstand, just as a masked figure stepped into the room. Damien fired twice, hitting the intruder in the chest. The man dropped, but the heavy thud of combat boots echoing in the hallway told Damien there were a dozen more where he came from. He moved into the hallway, bare-chested, his mind racing. His men were screaming, caught completely off guard. He needed to get to the panic room in his study on the ground floor. He fought his way down the grand staircase, exchanging fire with shadows in the dark. He found Thomas at the bottom of the stairs, bleeding heavily from a shoulder wound. "They're everywhere, boss," Thomas gasped, clutching his arm. "They cut the comms. We're sitting ducks." Damien dragged Thomas behind the heavy marble pillars of the foyer. The front doors had been blown open, and rain lashed into the house. Flashlights cut through the darkness as Carmichael's mercenaries moved through the mansion, executing any of Russo's men they found. They were pinned down. Damien had 3 rounds left in his 1911. Thomas was rapidly losing blood. From the shadows of the dining room, 3 heavily armored men emerged, their laser sights cutting through the smoky air, locking onto the marble pillar where Damien was hiding. This is it, Damien thought, a cold, furious resignation washing over him. He was going to die in his own home, outmaneuvered and outgunned. Suddenly, a glass shattered in the kitchen corridor behind the mercenaries. The 3 men spun around, their rifles raised. From the darkness of the corridor stepped Valerie. She was still wearing her black maid's skirt, but she had stripped off the white apron. In her hands, she held an HK 416 assault rifle stripped from the body of one of Damien's dead guards in the hallway. Damien stared in absolute shock. The quiet, submissive girl who dusted his books was holding the heavy weapon perfectly tucked into her shoulder, her stance aggressive, her elbows tucked in tight. Her eyes, usually cast downward, were locked onto the targets with cold, terrifying. "Hey," Valerie said, her voice eerily calm, ringing out over the sound of the storm. The mercenaries barely had time to register the maid before she pulled the trigger. She didn't spray and pray. Valerie fired with controlled, devastating accuracy. Pop, pop. The first mercenary dropped, a bullet catching him right beneath the rim of his Kevlar helmet. Pop, pop. The second man went down, hit in the throat before he could even squeeze his trigger. The third mercenary panicked, swinging his rifle wildly toward her. Valerie moved flawlessly, dropping to one knee to reduce her profile, while simultaneously firing a 3-round burst that shattered the man's sternum. In less than 4 seconds, the 3 elite killers were dead on the marble floor. Silence descended on the foyer, broken only by the howling wind and the rain. Damien slowly stepped out from behind the pillar, his gun lowered, staring at the woman as if she were an apparition. Valerie didn't even look at him. She swiftly moved to the bodies, efficiently stripping them of extra magazines. She checked the chamber of her rifle, slapped a fresh magazine in, and chambered a round with a sharp metallic clack. "What the hell are you?" Damien finally breathed out, his voice hoarse. Valerie finally looked up, meeting the Mafia boss's eyes directly for the first time in 6 months. There was no fear in them, only the icy, calculating stare of a predator. "I'm your housekeeper, Mr. Russo," Valerie said flatly, tossing a spare rifle to Damien, which he caught by pure reflex. "And right now, this house is a mess. I suggest we clean it up." Before Damien could process the absurdity and the adrenaline of the moment, the sound of heavier boots and shouting echoed from the east wing. Carmichael's second wave was coming. Valerie didn't wait for his orders. She moved past him with terrifying grace, sliding into the darkness of the grand hallway, her weapon raised, hunting the men who had dared to step onto her floor with muddy boots. Damien Russo, the most feared man in Chicago, looked at his bleeding lieutenant, looked at the rifle in his hands, and realized the deadliest person in his syndicate had been making his espresso for the last 6 months. And for the first time that night, Damien smiled. The grand hallway of the Oakhaven estate, usually a testament to imported Italian luxury and quiet generational wealth, had become a war zone. The storm raging outside cast jagged, stroboscopic flashes of lightning through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the swirling dust and the thick, acrid smoke of discharged firearms. Valerie moved through the chaos like a phantom. Damien followed a few paces behind, his Kimber 1911 swapped for the heavier, more reliable HK 416 Valerie had tossed him. He was a man who had grown up in the violent crucible of the East Coast underworld. He had survived assassination attempts, hostile takeovers, and brutal gang wars in the streets of Brooklyn. But watching his housekeeper systematically clear a 70-foot corridor of highly trained paramilitary operatives was an entirely different class of violence. She didn't fight with the raw, chaotic aggression of a mafia enforcer. She fought with a terrifying algorithmic efficiency. 2 targets, behind the overturned mahogany table, Valerie whispered, her voice barely registering over the roar of thunder. She had pressed her back flat against the wall, just outside the library doors. She held up her left hand, flashing 2 fingers, then tapped her own chest and pointed toward the far flank. Damien nodded. He understood the tactical shorthand. He laid down, suppressing fire, the deafening roar of his rifle shattering the remaining crystal wall sconces. Splinters of expensive wood and plaster erupted into the air as the mercenaries behind the table ducked for cover. In that microsecond of distraction, Valerie broke from the wall. She slid across the blood-slicked marble, her black and white uniform a blur in the darkness. As she cleared the edge of the table, she didn't raise her rifle to her eye. She fired purely from instinct and muscle memory. 2 distinct, suppressed bursts. Both men slumped silently against the wainscoting. Damien stepped out from his cover, his breathing heavy, adrenaline-pumping battery acid through his veins. He looked at the bodies, then at Valerie. She was already checking her magazine, her face entirely devoid of emotion. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" Damien demanded, his voice low, vibrating with a mixture of suspicion and awe. "And don't tell me it was at a housekeeping seminar." Valerie finally looked at him. A flash of lightning illuminated her pale features, highlighting the sharp line of her jaw and the cold depths of her gray eyes. "Joint Special Operations Command," she replied flatly. "Task Force 121. We specialized in high-value target extraction and surgical strikes. Now, unless you want to be the next target extracted from this mortal coil, keep your weapon up. We have a mole to hunt." Damien's jaw tightened. "Vincent, your lieutenant, Valerie confirmed, moving toward the service stairs. The security cameras on the western gate were caught in a localized EMP loop. That requires a physical bypass from the estate's main server room. Only 3 people have the biometric clearance for that room: you, Thomas, and Vincent. Thomas was bleeding out in the foyer, having taken a bullet for Damien. That left only one suspect. They descended into the subterranean levels of the estate. The air down here was cooler, smelling of damp earth and ozone. The emergency red lighting bathed the concrete corridors in a sinister, bloody glow. As they approached the heavy steel door of the server room, Valerie raised a clenched fist. "Stop!" She pressed her ear to the thick metal. Faintly, the frantic clacking of a mechanical keyboard could be heard inside. Valerie looked at Damien and stepped back, gesturing to the electronic keypad. "It's biometric. Your thumbprint." Damien stepped forward, his face a mask of pure, murderous fury. He placed his thumb on the scanner. A soft beep echoed in the hall, and the heavy locking mechanisms clanked open. Valerie kicked the door open, sweeping into the room with her rifle raised. Damien was right beside her. Sitting at the central terminal, bathed in the blue light of a dozen monitors, was Vincent. He froze, his hands hovering over the keyboard. On the main screen, a progress bar showed 85% completion on a file transfer. He was downloading the encrypted ledger of the Russo Syndicate's offshore accounts and the blackmail files Damien held on half the state legislature. Vincent slowly turned his chair around. He looked at Damien, then at the rifle in Valerie's hands. A nervous, bitter laugh escaped his lips. "I told you to run a background check on the Maid, boss," Vincent sneered, though his hands were trembling. "Guess we both missed the warning signs." "Why?" Damien asked. It was a simple question, but it carried the weight of a death sentence. Damien and Vincent had grown up together. They had bled together in the streets of Little Italy. Because Silas Carmichael offered me a future that didn't involve playing second fiddle to a ghost, Vincent spat back, his fear morphing into defensive anger. "You've been hiding in this estate, Damien. You've gotten soft. Carmichael controls the docks, he's buying the local judges, and he offered me the entire East Coast distribution network. All I had to do was leave the back door open tonight. And let them butcher our men in their sleep," Damien said, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "It's business," Vincent shouted, standing up. "It's exactly what you would have done 5 years ago." Damien didn't argue. He didn't monologue. He simply raised his HK-416 and shot Vincent once directly in the center of his forehead. The lieutenant collapsed backward, his body crashing into the server racks, sparks flying as a monitor shattered. The room descended into a heavy, suffocating silence, save for the hum of the cooling fans. Damien stood over the body of his oldest friend, his chest heaving. For a moment, the untouchable Mafia boss looked incredibly tired, the weight of his crown bearing down on his shoulders. Valerie stepped past him without a word. She moved to the terminal, her fingers flying across the blood-spattered keyboard. She canceled the file transfer, engaged the terminal's physical lockdown protocol, and wiped the external drive Vincent had plugged in. "It's not over," Valerie said, her eyes fixed on one of the security monitors. Damien looked up. The screen displayed a feed from the main iron gates at the front of the estate, nearly half a mile down the winding driveway. 4 black armored Chevrolet Suburbans had just pulled up. Dozens of heavily armed men were spilling out, taking up tactical positions behind the stone pillars. And stepping out of the lead vehicle, holding a heavy black umbrella against the driving rain, was Silas Carmichael himself. "He's not sending proxies anymore," Damien noted, his grip tightening on his rifle. "He's here to claim the throne." "He's here because he thinks you're dead," Valerie corrected. Vincent was supposed to signal the all-clear. When the gunfire stopped, Silas assumed his mercenaries did their job. "He's walking into a secured perimeter, thinking it's his new home." Valerie turned to Damien, her eyes burning with a sudden, intense fire. "You asked me where I learned to shoot. I didn't tell you why I was hiding." Damien frowned. "Does it matter right now?" "It matters," Valerie insisted. 18 months ago, my JSOC unit was deployed to Bogota, Operation Nightfall. We were supposed to extract a cartel financier who wanted to turn state's evidence. It was a black op, entirely off the books. Only 3 people in Washington knew about it. She stepped closer to Damien, the space between them suddenly crackling with an electric tension. It was an ambush. Someone sold our operational coordinates to the cartel. My entire team's 6 good men were slaughtered in a kill zone. I only survived because I was providing overwatch from a mile away. I spent the next year hunting down the leak. And you found it, Damien deduced, reading the cold vengeance in her posture. I did, Valerie said. The leak was a corrupt intelligence committee chairman named Senator Robert Sterling. He sold my team to protect his own offshore cartel kickbacks. And guess who Senator Sterling's primary financial backer and political fixer is on the East Coast? Realization dawned on Damien's face. Silas Carmichael. Exactly, Valerie whispered. I couldn't touch Sterling. He has Secret Service protection. So I came looking for the man who handles his dirty money. I embedded myself in your house because you were Carmichael's biggest rival. I knew, eventually, he would make a move on you. And when he did, I knew he would expose himself. Damien stared at her. The woman he had ignored for 6 months had manipulated the entire criminal ecosystem just to get to this exact moment. She was brilliant. She was lethal. And for the first time in his life, Damien Russo felt completely outmatched. So, Damien said, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face, how do you want to kill him? I need elevation, and I need a heavy caliber, Valerie stated, her voice slicing through the chaotic aftermath in the server room. The HK-416 is useless at a distance. Silas is half a mile out, heavily armored. The armory, Damien replied, adrenaline sharpening his focus. 3rd floor. They bypassed the carnage, taking the freight elevator to the master suite. Damien pressed his thumb to a biometric scanner hidden behind a gilded mirror. The wall slid back, revealing a subterranean-style bunker stocked with military-grade hardware. Valerie ignored the flashy, gold-plated cartel trophies. Her eyes locked onto a reinforced case. She snapped it open to reveal an Accuracy International AXSR sniper rifle chambered in 338 Lapua Magnum. She hoisted the massive weapon, snatched 3 spare magazines, and turned to Damien. Grab a spotting scope and a suppressed designated marksman rifle, she ordered, entirely shedding her disguise. You're my spotter. We take the roof. They navigated a narrow spiral staircase, pushing open the heavy access hatch into the howling storm. The wind was a brutal 30 miles per hour, driving freezing rain across the slick slate tiles of the Oakhaven estate. Crawling to the edge of the parapet, Valerie deployed the bipod. Below them, a half-mile down the winding driveway, the blazing headlights of 4 armored Suburbans cut through the darkness. Damien lay flat beside her, peering through a loopholed spotting scope. Target acquired. He's stepping out of the lead vehicle, surrounded by a physical shield of 4 men. They're waiting for the gate override. Distance? Valerie asked, her eye welded to the optic. 840 yards. Crosswind, left to right, gusting up to 35, Damien reported, checking his digital anemometer. It's a nightmare shot, Val. The rain will drag the bullet. There are no bad shots, Valerie whispered, her breathing slowing to a rhythmic, meditative crawl. Only bad math. Her wet fingers dialed the elevation and windage turrets click, click, click. Through the crosshairs, Silas Carmichael was a blurry figure, smoking a cigar under an umbrella, entirely oblivious to the phantom from Bogota aiming at his chest. Send it, Damien breathed. Valerie exhaled. At the absolute bottom of her respiratory pause, she squeezed the trigger. Boom! The 338 Lapua roared, a flash of violent yellow lighting up the rooftop. Exactly 1.2 seconds later, the massive round tore through the umbrella canvas, bypassed the guards, and struck Silas dead center. The kinetic force launched him backward into the armored SUV. He was dead before his cigar hit the wet asphalt. Valerie instantly cycled the bolt. Boom! A second round shattered the engine block of the lead Suburban, permanently trapping the convoy. Panic erupted below. Cut off and leaderless, Carmichael's surviving mercenaries broke rank and fled into the tree line. The war was over. 2 hours later, dawn cast a cold light over the blood-stained estate. Damien sat in his ruined study, the scent of cordite heavy in the air. He was battered, exhausted, but alive. The splintered door groaned open. Valerie walked in. The uniform was gone. She wore dark tactical cargo pants and a fitted black sweater, her hair falling in damp waves. In her hand, she carried a silver tray holding a steaming porcelain cup. She set the perfectly bitter espresso on his desk and sank into the leather armchair opposite him, a blatant defiance of the old hierarchy. "You don't work for me anymore, Valerie," Damien said softly, taking a sip. "Old habits," she replied, crossing her legs. Her gray eyes held a dangerous, calculating gleam. "Besides, we have business. I took out your rival. Now I need capital, a network, and an army to burn Senator Sterling's life to the ground. You have a power vacuum and an empire to rebuild." Damien leaned forward, studying the lethal, brilliant woman who had played the fool in this very room. "Are you offering your services?" "I'm proposing a partnership," Valerie corrected, a predatory smile touching her lips. "Together, we don't just hold the East Coast, we take the whole board." Damien reached across the desk. "Partners." Valerie took his hand. The maid was gone. The queen had arrived. Did Valerie's lethal transition from silent housekeeper to mafia queen leave you breathless? If you loved this intense, action-packed twist on underworld romance, hit that like button, share this story with your fellow drama addicts, and subscribe to the channel for more gripping original sagas. Drop a comment below. Would you have trusted Valerie after the ambush? Let us know, and stay tuned for the next thrilling drop.